There are places in this world where the soil remembers everything, where the dust between the hills carries names that should have been forgotten decades ago, where old men still lower their voices when certain surnames come up in conversation, where children are taught before they learn to read who their enemies are. East Texas is one of those places. And in the summer of 1976, when the rest of America was celebrating its bicentennial, waving flags and lighting fireworks, two families in a forgotten corner of Nacogdoches County were doing something else entirely. They were counting their dead. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what happened out there on Route 7, between two cattle farms, beneath a sky so wide and blue it seemed almost mocking. What matters are the Hargroves and the Calloways and the 18 people who would not survive the year. To understand how it ended, you have to understand how it began. And like most things in East Texas, it began with land. It always begins with land. The year was 1941. The entire country was holding its breath after Pearl Harbor, and men across America were volunteering for a war none of them truly understood. Among them was a young man named Earl Hargrove, 22 years old, square-jawed, stubborn as the red clay earth he'd grown up on. Before Earl shipped out to the Pacific, he did what young men did in those days. He shook hands. He shook hands with his neighbor, a man named Doyle Calloway, and the two men made an agreement. Nothing written, nothing witnessed, just two men, a fence post, and the kind of promise that felt permanent because the world felt like it might end. Earl Hargrove agreed to let Doyle Calloway graze his cattle on the eastern 40 acres of Hargrove land for free for the duration of the war, as long as Doyle looked after the property. Earl never imagined he'd need to take it back. But Earl Hargrove came home from the Pacific in 1945. He came home missing 2 fingers on his left hand, with a distant look in his eyes that his wife said never fully went away. He came home to find Doyle Calloway's cattle still on his eastern 40 acres. He asked for the land back. Doyle said no. Not rudely, not violently. He simply looked at Earl Hargrove across that same fence post in that same East Texas heat and said, "Earl, I improved that land. I worked it. My boys worked it. It belongs to us now." And just like that, a handshake became a wound that would fester for 36 years. Now, you might wonder why two families couldn't simply settle a land dispute through the courts, and the answer tells you everything you need to know about rural East Texas in the mid-20th century. The courts were slow, the courts were expensive, and more than anything else, the courts were somewhere else. Out on Route 7, between those two cattle farms, there was only family pride. And family pride in that part of the world was the closest thing to religion most men knew. Earl Hargrove died in 1959. He died having never recovered his 40 acres. On his deathbed, according to his son Raymond, Earl grabbed his boy's wrist and said just 4 words, "Don't let them keep it." Raymond Hargrove was 28 years old when his father said those words. He had his father's jaw, his father's stubbornness, and now his father's grudge. He also had 3 brothers, Walter, Gene, and Bobby Hargrove. And in the years that followed, as those brothers married and had children of their own, the grudge was passed down like a name, like a birthright. Across the fence line, the Calloway family was doing the same thing. Doyle Calloway had 4 sons too, Lyle, Merle, Hank, and the youngest, Curtis Calloway, who everyone called C.W. They grew up hearing that the Hargroves were dangerous, bitter, the kind of men who smiled at you and sharpened a knife behind your back. And so 2 families, separated by a fence line, a broken handshake, and 30 years of accumulated rage, raised their children to be enemies. By 1970, there were 26 Hargroves living within 15 miles of Route 7 and 22 Calloways. They went to different churches, they shopped at different stores, they drank at different bars. They didn't look each other in the eye on the rare occasions they crossed paths in town. But they watched each other constantly, and they waited. The waiting ended on a Friday night in April of 1976. It ended the way so many things end in small towns, at a bar, over something small, between men who had too much pride and too little patience. The bar was called the Dusty Rail Tavern, about 6 miles south of Center, Texas. It was the kind of place with a jukebox that only played Merle Haggard and a bartender named Pete who kept a Louisville Slugger under the counter. Curtis Calloway, C.W., the youngest Calloway boy, was there that night with 2 of his cousins, Junior and Dale Calloway. They were celebrating nothing in particular, just a Friday. Raymond Hargrove's son, Tommy Hargrove, was also there that night. Tommy was 24 years old, good-looking kid. His friends said he had a temper that moved faster than his brain. Nobody knows exactly what was said. What we know is that at approximately 10:40 p.m., Tommy Hargrove threw a beer bottle. It caught above Junior Calloway's left eye and split the skin to the bone. Junior needed 16 stitches. C.W. Calloway responded by breaking a pool cue across Tommy Hargrove's back. By the time Pete, the bartender, came around with his Louisville Slugger, there were 5 men bleeding on the floor and 2 more crawling toward the door. The sheriff came, took statements, filed a report that went nowhere. But the phone calls that went out that night from the Calloway farm and the Hargrove farm, those went somewhere. Raymond Hargrove, 65 years old, sat in his kitchen at midnight, listening to his son Tommy describe what happened. Raymond didn't say much. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon, pushed one across the table to Tommy, and then he said, "Next time, don't throw a bottle. Use something they'll remember." That was the moment, right there. That was the first stone. Over the following 18 months, the incidents escalated in the way that these things always do, gradually, then suddenly. June 1974. 3 Hargrove cattle found shot dead in the north pasture. No witnesses, no arrests. August 1974. A Calloway barn, the old red one on the eastern property, burned to the foundation on a Sunday morning while the family was at church. The fire marshal ruled it electrical. The Calloways ruled it Hargrove. November 1974, Lyle Calloway's truck was run off the county road by an unknown vehicle. Lyle broke his collarbone, said he recognized the truck. The sheriff found no evidence. February 1975,
Walter Hargrove's son, 19-year-old Danny Hargrove, was found beaten unconscious behind the feed store in town. He spent 4 days in the hospital, told investigators he didn't see his attackers clearly. He was lying. And so it went. Each act of violence just below the threshold of what the law would seriously pursue. Each one answered, each answer escalating slightly beyond what came before. The families were communicating in the only language both sides had agreed to speak. By the spring of 1976, the original dispute, 35 years old, dusty, almost abstract, barely mattered anymore. Nobody was really fighting about 40 acres of land. They were fighting because Tommy Hargrove's back still ached where the pool cue hit him.